No hospital could explain the burning. The convulsions came without warning, consuming her small body from the inside out, and the finest doctors in the country had nothing left to offer. Her mother had spent everything: money, hope, time, chasing answers that never came. Then, on one rain-soaked night, the girl collapsed on a sidewalk, and the man who crouched beside her wasn't a physician. He was a street cleaner, dirty, silent, invisible to everyone around him. What he did next, no one saw coming. And by morning, everything had changed. Daniel was 38 years old, and he had the kind of face that told a long story without speaking a word of it. Quiet eyes, steady hands, a posture that didn't ask for anything. He wore his city-issue uniform without complaint and moved through his route with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to find dignity in the doing rather than in the being seen. He was a single father. His daughter, Emily, was 8 years old and asleep in the apartment 3 blocks over, with the neighbor watching through the wall. He had raised Emily to be kind and curious, to say good morning to strangers, to notice the world around her. It was the most important curriculum he knew, and he delivered it every day without textbooks or fanfare. Most of the people Daniel passed on his route didn't look at him. That was fine. He had long since stopped measuring his worth by other people's attention. He swept, he noticed, he thought, and in those quiet pre-dawn hours, the city spoke a different language, one of shadows and puddles, and the particular hush that falls over a place when the last bars have closed and the first bakers haven't yet arrived. Daniel understood that language. He had been fluent in it for 4 years. What very few people knew, what almost no one bothered to ask about, was that Daniel Hayes had not always held a broom. A decade earlier, he had held the precise and patient instruments of a biomedical technician. He had spent 7 years in a research environment, studying how human bodies responded to stimuli, how the nervous system translated external signals into internal experience. He was good at it. Not the flashiest person in the room, but the one who noticed things others missed, who kept careful notes, who returned to problems again and again until they gave something up. Then his wife had gotten sick, and then she had died. And the version of Daniel who wore a lab coat had quietly stepped aside for the version who needed to be home by 6 in the morning before Emily woke up. He didn't talk about the transition. He thought of it as a choice, not a sacrifice. And choices, in his experience, were just the shape a life took when you were paying attention. He kept a small notebook in the front pocket of his uniform jacket, not because anyone asked him to, but because his mind worked better when he could record things. Patterns, he observed, questions that occurred to him, ideas that arrived during the long, quiet stretches of the route. Emily had once found the notebook and declared it a book about noticing things. That was, Daniel had thought, exactly right. It was a book about noticing things. And on the night everything changed, the notebook was in his pocket, and the rain had just started. Across the city, Lily Whitmore was not sleeping. She almost never slept anymore. The timeline of Lily's illness was difficult to trace with any precision. It had begun almost a year earlier as occasional headaches, nothing alarming, the kind of thing that made a pediatrician nod thoughtfully and suggest more water and less screen time. Then the headaches became migraines. Then the migraines became episodes, sudden, overwhelming surges of pain that seemed to have no trigger, no pattern, no mercy. By the time Sophia had taken Lily to the 3rd specialist, the word episodic had given way to chronic. By the 7th, chronic had given way to silence. Sophia had not taken the silence gracefully. She was, by nature and by training, a woman who converted obstacles into action. She ran a mid-sized technology consulting firm with surgical efficiency that made competitors nervous and employees quietly grateful. She was not someone who accepted "we don't know" as a final answer. So she had pushed. She had hired a case manager to coordinate between specialists. She had flown Lily to a children's hospital in Houston, known for treating rare neurological conditions. She had enrolled her in a clinical trial for an experimental anti-inflammatory compound that showed early promise in adolescent populations. She had spent, in total, somewhere north of $1.2 million. Though she had stopped counting around the 600,000 mark because the number had begun to feel less like a fact and more like a wound. And still, Lily burned. The phrase was Lily's own. She had started using it around month 4 when the pain had become specific enough that she needed words for it. "Mom, it burns inside," she would say, in a voice that was too calm for its content, the way children sometimes speak when they have lived with something long enough to stop being surprised by it. Those 3 words had become the most devastating sentence in Sophia's vocabulary. She heard them in meetings. She heard them in the shower. She heard them in the blank. Dark moments at 2 in the morning when she lay in bed doing the arithmetic of failure and could not make it add up to anything hopeful. The night that Lily's last specialist delivered his final assessment was the night something broke open in Sophia's chest. The doctor was kind about it. He used words like management and quality of life and realistic expectations. He was thorough and compassionate and completely useless. Sophia sat across from him in a leather chair that cost more than some people's monthly rent and listened to him explain, in the gentlest possible terms, that modern medicine had exhausted its current toolkit. There was nothing else to try. Not at this time. She did not cry in the office. She waited until she was in the parking structure, pressed her face into her hands, and let herself come apart for exactly 4 minutes. Then she dried her eyes and began the business of figuring out what came next. She just didn't know yet that what came next would be standing on a rain-soaked sidewalk, holding her daughter's hand while a man in a gray uniform told her something that no physician had ever thought to say. The rain came fast that night, no warning. Just an immediate and serious downpour that turned the street surfaces into mirrors and sent the few remaining pedestrians ducking into doorways. Daniel turned up his collar and kept walking. He had a route to finish, and he was not made uncomfortable by rain. He heard her before he saw her. A high, raw sound that didn't belong to the urban palette of rain and traffic and distant sirens. He turned. 30 meters ahead, at the corner where the wider avenue met a narrow residential street, a woman was kneeling on the wet pavement beside a child who had collapsed. The woman's posture communicated several things simultaneously: terror, helplessness, the particular frozen quality of someone who had moved beyond panic into something quieter and more dangerous. 2 other pedestrians stood nearby under an overhang, watching with the careful detachment of people who had already decided the situation wasn't their responsibility. Daniel walked toward them without hesitation. Not running, he knew from experience, escalated situations. He walked quickly and steadily, the way he had learned to approach everything that required his full attention. The child on the pavement was small and pale and shaking in a way that had no performance in it. What Daniel knew in the first 5 seconds of observation was that this was not a standard seizure. The shaking was too irregular, too responsive to the environment around her. It diminished briefly when a car passed, with its headlights cutting through the rain, then intensified again. Her eyes were open and tracking. She was conscious, aware, in pain. Enormous pain. But not absent. "Can I look at her?" he said to the woman on the ground. Sophia Whitmore looked up at him. She registered his uniform, his broom propped against the nearby mailbox, the rain streaking down his face. Her expression passed through several stages in the space of a breath: confusion, assessment, desperation, and landed on something that was not quite trust but was at least the absence of refusal. She nodded once, sharply. Daniel crouched down. He did not touch the child. He studied her the way her hands were pressed flat against the wet concrete, the way she flinched at the high-pitched beep of a delivery vehicle reversing somewhere down the block. He watched the small muscles of her face tighten at each pulse of a neon sign cycling through its colors across the street. He had seen this kind of response once before, in the research environment subjects with severe environmental sensitivities, whose nervous systems processed external stimuli at a dramatically amplified register. The responses had looked something like this. Not identical, but in the same family. "This isn't a standard neurological event," he said quietly, more thinking aloud than speaking. Then to Sophia. "She's reacting to something around her, not from inside. Something external." "What?" Sophia said. "The light," Daniel said, nodding at the cycling neon across the street. "Watch her face when it pulses." Sophia watched. The neon cycled. Lily's expression tightened. "The sound of that vehicle," Daniel continued. "The frequency. Watch her hands." Sophia watched. The reversing truck beeped again. Lily pressed her palms harder against the ground. "I don't understand," Sophia said. Her voice was controlled, but only barely. "Neither do I yet," Daniel said. "But I think I might be able to." Sophia's first impulse was entirely reasonable. She looked at this man, his rain-soaked uniform, his broom, the worn fabric of his jacket, and she felt the reflex that she was not proud of, but could not entirely deny. The people who had earned the right to speak about Lily's condition wore tailored coats and had their names on hospital corridors. "I appreciate your concern," she said, in the tone she used for dismissing meetings that had run over time. "But we have doctors. Thank you." Two security men from the adjacent building appeared, and one started toward Daniel with the practiced authority of someone who spent his days deciding who belonged where. Daniel did not move. He also did not raise his voice. He simply said, "Her pain episodes, do they happen more inside than outside? Do they get worse in enclosed spaces with a lot of electronics?" The security guard stopped a few feet away, waiting for a signal from Sophia. Sophia had not moved. Her face had done something complicated. "How?" she said slowly. "Did you know to ask that?" It was not really a question. It was the sound of a woman whose mental model was rearranging itself around new information. "Because she's doing better out here in the rain than she was 10 minutes ago," Daniel said. "In the rain, there's less electromagnetic interference, less concentrated artificial light, fewer frequency sources. Her body is responding to the environment. That's not a psychological reaction. That's a physiological one." Lily, on the pavement, had stopped shaking quite so violently. She was still in pain, visible pain, the kind that had no pretense about it, but the acute edge of the episode appeared to be dimming, the way a fever sometimes breaks without ceremony. She was looking up at Daniel with the direct attention that children sometimes give to adults who are not trying to perform anything for them. "Who are you?" Sophia asked. "Daniel Hayes," he said. "I sweep this block, Tuesday through Saturday." "That's not what I mean." "I know," he said, "but it's the accurate answer." "Has her environment changed recently?" he asked after a pause. "New home, new school, renovation, anything like that?" Sophia's expression shifted again. "How recently?" 8 months ago. The timeline landed precisely where Daniel had suspected it would. "What kind of building?" "A penthouse, a new development. The whole floor was custom built. New materials," Daniel said. "New wiring. Smart home systems. A lot of wireless infrastructure at close range." Sophia stared at him. "The symptoms started about a month after we moved in." "I know," he said. "You can't know that. I didn't tell you when the symptoms started." "You told me enough," he said simply. The rest was visible. He looked at Lily. "She's sensitive to her environment in a way that most people aren't. It's a real condition. Environmental sensitivity syndrome. There are subsets involving electromagnetic frequency, intolerance, chemical sensitivity, photosensitivity, Most doctors don't test for it because it sits at the edge of conventional diagnostics, and because the symptoms look like other things. Sophia was quiet for a long moment. The rain fell. Lily had closed her eyes and was breathing with something approaching peace for the first time in longer than her mother could remember. "You could be completely wrong," Sophia said finally. "I could be," Daniel agreed. "I probably am about some of it. But I'm not wrong about what I'm seeing right now. She is better out here than she was in there. There are moments in a person's life when the choice in front of them is not between the safe option and the risky one. Sometimes it's between two different kinds of risk, the known failure and the unknown possibility. Sophia had spent 11 months choosing the known failure. The conventional path, the credentialed opinion, the medical establishment's endless refinements of the same essential helplessness. It had cost her more than money. It had cost her the particular brand of hope that is specific to new possibilities, that open, vulnerable feeling of believing something might actually work. And here, in the rain, was a man with a broom and a theory. She thought about Lily's face when the specialist had delivered his final assessment. She thought about the word management and what it meant when applied to a 10-year-old child. She thought about the way Lily had looked in the hospital bed 2 weeks earlier, small and exhausted, and still saying, quietly and without accusation, "Mom, it burns inside." "I'll give you one night," Sophia said. Her voice was steady, the way it got when she was making a decision she was committed to, regardless of what it cost her. "One night. If you can show me something real, I'll listen. If you can't, then you'll have lost nothing," Daniel said. "She'll still be exactly where she was." It was not a sales pitch. It was a statement of fact, delivered without flourish or pressure. That, more than anything else he had said, was what made Sophia believe that this man was not performing certainty. He genuinely did not know if he was right. He only knew what he had observed. And, in Sophia's experience, the most trustworthy people were the ones who could tell you exactly where the edge of their knowledge was. "All right," she said. One night. What followed was not dramatic in the conventional sense. Daniel asked Sophia to bring Lily to the guest bedroom on the lower floor of the penthouse, the room that sat directly above the building's original concrete foundation, rather than above the mechanical floor where the building's wireless infrastructure was concentrated. He walked through the space first, slowly, taking note of what was present. The smart home panel, the wireless sound system, the electronically controlled lighting grid, the sleep monitoring device on the nightstand, the charging station built into the bedside table. He asked Sophia to identify which systems could be switched off versus which were hardwired into the building. She watched him move through the room with a feeling she could not quite name. It was not attraction, yet it was something more disorienting. It was the feeling of watching someone inhabit a space in a way that made the space suddenly reveal itself. Daniel was not performing competence. He simply had it, and it moved through the room ahead of him like a quiet force. He disconnected the wireless panel. He found an old-fashioned power strip and cut everything else from the circuit. He located heavy blackout curtains in a hall closet and hung them over the windows, eliminating the neon and street light from the room entirely. He asked Sophia if she had any battery-powered devices. She produced a camping lantern and a small battery fan from a storage closet, remnants of a trip she and Lily had taken 2 summers ago. Before any of this had begun, he set the fan to circulate air without generating the electrical field of a plugged-in appliance. He found old cotton quilts in a cedar chest and arranged them without comment. When he was done, the room looked simpler and older than the rest of the penthouse, more like a child's room from a different decade, before the world had learned to fill every space with signals. He brought Lily in. She moved carefully, the way people move when they have learned that ordinary motion can detonate ordinary suffering. She looked at the dim lamp, the quiet fan, the stripped-down simplicity of it all, and something in her face did a small, almost invisible thing, as if some circuit of anticipation had relaxed. "Lie down," Daniel said, gently. Lily lay down. Daniel sat in the corner chair, not hovering, not intervening, just present. Watching. The way he watched everything. Sophia sat on the edge of the bed, her hand resting near her daughter's, not quite touching. For the first 20 minutes, the pain was still audible in the tension of Lily's body, in the way she held her breath between regular breaths, in the slight rocking motion she had developed as a coping mechanism. Daniel said nothing. He watched her hands, her face, the rise and fall of her chest. He made small, silent notes in his notebook. Then, gradually, the tension in Lily's shoulders began to release. The rocking slowed, the breath deepened. At the 40-minute mark, Lily's eyes had closed, not in the taut, resistant way they closed when she was fighting wakefulness, but in the soft, involuntary way of a body that has stopped bracing itself against a pain it can no longer feel as strongly. By midnight, she was asleep. Not medicated, not sedated, asleep. Daniel looked across the room at Sophia. She was watching her daughter with an expression that had no vocabulary for itself, something between disbelief and grief, and a tenderness so concentrated it was almost hard to look at directly. Her hands were in her lap, and they were shaking. "Is this going to last?" she whispered. "I don't know," Daniel said quietly. "Tonight, yes. Beyond tonight depends on what we understand and what we change. But this, what's happening right now, this is real." Sophia nodded once, very slowly, the way a person nods when they are accepting something that changes the shape of their world. Morning came without urgency. The rain had stopped sometime before 4, and the city had dried into a clean, washed version of its usual self, the kind of morning that only exists after a long night of weather, when the light has a different quality and the air is not yet complicated by the day's accumulation of noise. Lily woke at 6:47. Sophia knew the exact moment. Because she had not slept, she had sat in the corner chair and watched her daughter breathe for 6 hours, counting the minutes as evidence. Lily opened her eyes and lay still for a moment, doing what she always did upon waking, taking inventory of her body, waiting for the pain to announce itself. It didn't. She turned her head and looked at her mother. Her face was the face of a child who is not sure what to do with the absence of a thing that has been present for so long it had started to feel like a permanent feature of existing. "Mom," she said, "it doesn't burn." Sophia Whitmore, who had not cried in front of her daughter in 11 months, made a sound that had no name and gathered Lily into her arms with the particular fierceness of someone who has been afraid to hold on too tight and has just been given permission to stop being afraid. Daniel was in the kitchen, making coffee the way he always did, quietly, without fuss. He had found a pour-over setup and used it because it required no interaction with the smart home system. When Sophia appeared in the doorway, Lily in tow, both of them looking like the aftermath of a storm in the best possible sense, he handed her a mug without ceremony. "The pediatrician should still see her," he said. "What happened last night doesn't replace a proper evaluation. It just gives the doctors a different direction to look." The pediatrician was thorough and open-minded and had spent months puzzling over Lily's case. She ran that morning's standard assessments and found no acute symptoms. She noted, carefully, that Lily's baseline readings were the most normal they had been in nearly a year. She referred the case to a specialist in environmental medicine, a field that sat at the intersection of traditional clinical practice and the emerging science of environmental sensitivity disorders. The specialist, a woman named Dr. Patricia Renaud, who operated out of a research clinic 40 minutes north of the city, took one look at the case timeline and said, with the calm of someone who had seen this before, "Environmental sensitivity syndrome, likely with electromagnetic frequency component. Underdiagnosed, absolutely real, and very, very treatable once you know what you're dealing with. The story broke 6 weeks later. Not through any organized campaign, it began when a family friend mentioned it in passing to a journalist, and the journalist did what journalists do, asked if there was more to it. There was considerably more to it. Sophia agreed to an interview because she believed that what had happened to Lily was happening in some variation to other children and families sitting in the same expensive waiting rooms she had sat in, being told the same expensive version of nothing. If this story could direct even a few of them toward a different question, it was worth the telling. The piece that ran was meticulous and careful. The headline was plain and accurate. A street cleaner's observation had led to a diagnosis that $1.2 million in medical care couldn't reach. It was not sensationalized. It did not require sensationalization. The response was, by any measure, extraordinary. People who had been following Lily's story through Sophia's occasional updates read the piece and shared it with the urgency of people who recognize something. Parents of children with unexplained chronic symptoms. Adults who had spent years being told their pain was psychosomatic. Physicians who had suspected environmental sensitivity as a factor in cases they couldn't otherwise explain, and had hesitated to say so for fear of being dismissed. And then there were the people who recognized Daniel Hayes. Several of them worked in the building where he swept. One was a former colleague from his biomedical technician days, a woman who had worked alongside him for 4 years, and who, upon seeing his photograph in the article, sent a message to the journalist that read simply, "He was the best diagnostician I ever worked next to. I never understood why he left." Sophia was asked, in the course of several interviews, whether she felt embarrassed that she had initially dismissed Daniel. She did not deflect the question. "Yes," she said, flatly. "I looked at his uniform and I made a decision about what he was capable of knowing. That was wrong. I've thought about it often since how many times that happens. How many times someone with real knowledge is standing in front of someone who needs it, and the person who needs it can't see past the surface. When the question of a financial reward came up, and it came up in every interview, because it was the narrative logic the story seemed to demand, Daniel's response was consistent. He didn't want money. He had a job. He had Emily. He had a notebook full of observations that were already becoming, at Dr. Renaud's enthusiastic invitation, the basis of a formal research consultation. What he asked for, when someone powerful enough to actually grant something asked what he needed, was simple. He said, "There are people in jobs like mine, service workers, custodians, drivers, people who move through the world invisibly, and a lot of them are observant. A lot of them notice things. They're in the spaces where things happen every day. Nobody asks them what they've seen. Start asking." Sophia established the Lily Whitmore Foundation 3 months after the story broke. It funded research into environmental sensitivity disorders, partnered with Dr. Renaud's clinic to develop a standardized diagnostic pathway for atypically presenting cases, and at Daniel's specific request, launched a pilot program in 3 cities, training medical intake staff to conduct more thorough environmental and occupational histories. Daniel joined the Foundation's advisory board as a research consultant, which meant that he now divided his professional life between his night route and occasional meetings in conference rooms where people took notes when he spoke. He found both things equally real, equally his. He had long since stopped organizing the world into categories of important and unimportant. Everything was important if you looked at it with sufficient attention. Emily and Lily became friends with the velocity and completeness that only children are capable of. They had almost nothing in common on paper, different ages, different backgrounds, different schools. In practice, they had the specific compatibility of 2 children who had each, in different ways, spent time in the proximity of difficulty and emerged from it kinder and more curious than before. They spent Saturday afternoons at the public library, where they maintained a running argument about whether marine biology or structural engineering was the more interesting field, which they conducted with cheerful seriousness and showed no signs of resolving. Sophia watched them sometimes from the corner of the library's children's section, the way parents watch their children when they think no one is observing them, with a mixture of love and relief. So close together, they were almost indistinguishable. On those Saturday afternoons, Daniel would sometimes also be there, sitting at a nearby table with his notebook and whatever technical paper Dr. Renaud had forwarded him that week, reading with the concentrated quiet of a person who genuinely enjoyed the work of learning things. He and Sophia did not talk about what was growing between them. Not for a long time. It was not avoidance, it was more like respect. Neither of them was in a hurry. Both had been shaped by losses that taught them the specific value of not rushing the things that mattered. They moved around each other in the library and in the Foundation's working meetings with the careful attentiveness of two people who were finding out, gradually and without pressure, whether what they were building had the structural integrity to hold weight. It was Emily who named it first. Not to them, but to Lily, in the unself-conscious way of an 8-year-old who had not yet learned to treat obvious things as complicated. "I think your mom likes my dad," she said, over a library book about deep-sea creatures. Lily considered this with great seriousness. "I think so too," she said. "Do you think your dad likes my mom? He writes more in his notebook when she's around," Emily said, an observation so precise and characteristic it could only have come from someone who had spent her whole life learning to notice things from a man who had spent his whole life doing the same. There is a version of this story that ends with a lesson stated plainly, the moral delivered like a gift with a bow on it. But the truth of what happened to Daniel Hayes and Sophia Whitmore and the two girls who had become, without ceremony, something like a family, is quieter and stranger and more durable than a lesson. It is the truth of what happens when the invisible is made visible, when the dismissed is taken seriously, when the person standing in the right place at the right time turns out to be carrying a broom instead of a badge. Lily continued her treatment under Dr. Renaud's care. The progress was not linear. Few things that matter ever are, but the direction was clear and steady. The penthouse was retrofitted with low EMF wiring and shielded from the building's central wireless infrastructure at a cost significantly less than a single month of the specialist appointments that had preceded it. Lily went back to school. She played soccer on Saturdays. She read books about the ocean and debated their scientific merit with Emily, with great vigor and slightly less accuracy than she believed. Daniel still worked the night route. He had been offered other positions and had accepted the advisory role while declining the rest. He liked the night. He liked the particular quality of attention the empty streets demanded. He liked the notebook and the observations, and the way the city revealed itself in its unhurried hours to anyone patient enough to wait for it. Emily, who was 9 now and becoming the kind of person who asked large questions with small words, had asked her father once whether he was happy. He had considered the question with appropriate seriousness. "I'm more useful than I used to be," he said finally, "and I think you're going to be great." "That's not what happy means," Emily said. "Maybe not," Daniel said, "but it's what it feels like from the inside. Not every person who saves a life looks the part. Not every answer comes labeled with the authority of its source. The city, in its long, dark hours, is full of people who know things that no credential certifies and no title announces. People who have carried their knowledge through the unlikely passages of loss and change and quiet persistence, and who are standing, right now, in exactly the place where it is needed. The only question is whether anyone is paying enough attention to hear what they're saying. Sometimes, in the early mornings, when the rain has passed and the street is clean and the city is taking its first soft breaths of the coming day, Daniel Hayes finishes his route and stands for a moment at the corner where it all began. He doesn't think about it as a monument or a turning point. He thinks about it the way he thinks about everything in his notebook, as a data point, one carefully observed fact among the accumulated thousands of his life. The street is clean. His daughter is sleeping. Somewhere on a higher floor, a child he helped is dreaming without pain. He picks up his broom. He keeps walking. Not everyone who saves a life wears a white coat. Sometimes all it takes is someone who learned to pay attention and never stopped.